The arrival of the YVRE was unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. They were not invaders, nor were they desperate refugees. They came in ships that shimmered like liquid silver, descending from the skies with precision and grace. Their language was complex, yet their minds adapted quickly to human speech. They brought technology that defied human understanding, healing devices that could mend broken bones in seconds, energy sources that could power entire cities without pollution. And yet, for all their advancements, they had come to Earth with a simple request: sanctuary. Rayhan was one of the many scientists assigned to the Human YVRE Diplomatic Initiative, a program designed to foster understanding between the two species. His specialty was bioengineering, and he had been given unprecedented access to YVRE medical technology. Most of his colleagues saw the aliens as an enigma to be studied, but Rayhan had always been fascinated by their culture, their way of life. Unlike humans, who built their societies on ever-changing ideals, the YVRE lived by a strict, immutable set of traditions. Their people were bound by honor, by ancient laws that governed everything from governance to personal relationships. It was during one of these diplomatic exchanges that Rayhan first met her. Alira was unlike any of the YVRE he had encountered. Most of them carried themselves with a cool, distant elegance, but she radiated warmth. Her golden hair shimmered faintly in the light, and her eyes, a deep shade of violet, held an intensity that unsettled him. She moved with a quiet confidence, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Yet there was something in her gaze, something that made Rayhan feel as if he were being seen in a way he never had before. Their first interaction was brief. Alira was part of a delegation discussing the integration of YVRE medicine into human hospitals. Rayhan had spoken at length about the differences between human and YVRE biology, his voice steady, analytical. He was explaining the challenges of adapting YVRE healing pods to human physiology when he noticed Alira watching him with unnerving focus. Later, when the meeting concluded, she approached him. "You speak as if you wish to understand," she said, her voice soft yet firm. Rayhan hesitated before responding. "I do. That's why I'm here." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good." That was all she said before she turned and left. At the time, Rayhan thought little of it. The YVRE were known for their enigmatic ways, and he had grown accustomed to their cryptic remarks. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that in that moment, something irreversible had happened. For the YVRE, love was not something that happened gradually. It was not a thing to be tested, debated, or abandoned. It was a singular, absolute decision. When an YVRE chose a mate, it was permanent. No second chances. No changes of heart. The bond was unbreakable, etched into their very being. And Alira had chosen him. Rayhan had no idea. He continued his work, unaware of the turmoil unfolding within Alira. She had not expected this, had not been prepared for the overwhelming certainty that had struck her the moment she locked eyes with him. Among her people, such bonds were sacred, a moment of absolute clarity. She had heard stories of it, of how her ancestors had known the instant they had found their mate. But she had never expected to experience it herself. And never with a human. For days she said nothing. She observed him from a distance, struggling with the weight of what had happened. Did he feel it too? Was there some part of him that recognized what she already knew? But as she watched him interact with his fellow humans, laughing, speaking with ease, she realized the truth. He didn't know. He didn't understand. Alira had bound herself to a man who had no concept of what it meant. The realization terrified her. YVRE law was clear. Once a mate was chosen, there was no undoing it. If the bond was not returned, the one who had chosen was destined for a life of solitude. No other partner would ever be possible. Alira would never love again. The weight of it pressed down on her, but she forced herself to remain silent. She had made her choice, and now she would live with it. But fate had other plans. It was a week later when the YVRE elders summoned Rayhan. He arrived at the council chambers expecting another discussion about medical integration, but instead, he found himself facing a row of solemn YVRE leaders, their expressions unreadable. Elira stood among them. Rayhan of Earth, one of the elders spoke. There is a matter that must be addressed. A bond has been formed. Rayhan frowned. A bond? Elira stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly together. She did not meet his eyes. Among my people, love is absolute, she said carefully. When we choose, it is forever. There is no undoing it. Rayhan's confusion deepened. I don't understand. What does this have to do with me? Elira finally lifted her gaze to meet his. I have chosen you. Silence filled the chamber. Rayhan stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. You what? The elder spoke again. Elira has made the eternal choice. You are now her mate. Rayhan felt his stomach drop. That's impossible. I never agreed to this. The elder's expression did not change. Your agreement is not required. This is our way. His mind reeled. He turned to Elira, hoping desperately that this was some misunderstanding. You barely know me. She held his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something raw beneath her composed exterior. Fear. Vulnerability. It does not matter, she whispered. I knew the moment I saw you. Rayhan ran a hand through his hair, trying to grasp the reality of the situation. This was insane. No one just decided love like this. Love was supposed to be built over time, nurtured through shared experiences. It wasn't something that just happened. And yet, the way Elira looked at him, like he was the most important thing in her universe, unnerved him in a way he couldn't explain. What happens if I say no? He asked carefully. Elira flinched. The elder's face remained impassive. If you refuse, Elira will be alone for the rest of her life. Rayhan's breath caught. She will never take another mate, the elder continued. She will live, but she will never know companionship, never experience love again. It is our law. The weight of their words sank into him, heavy and inescapable. He barely knew her. He wasn't ready for something like this. And yet, if he walked away, he would condemn her to a lifetime of solitude. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something stopped him. Elira. She stood before him, still and silent, waiting for his answer. She did not beg. She did not try to convince him. She had accepted whatever choice he would make. And that was what made it so much harder. Rayhan exhaled, his voice quiet. I need time. Elira's expression did not change, but something in her shoulders relaxed. A small nod. I understand. The elders did not protest. They had done their duty. Now the decision rested with him. As Rayhan left the chamber, his mind was a storm of confusion. He had never believed in fate, but Elira did, and now, whether he wanted to or not, his life was bound to hers. Rayhan had always considered himself a rational man. Science governed his world, and emotions were things to be managed, analyzed, and understood. Yet, no amount of logic could prepare him for the situation he now found himself in. Elira had chosen him. A single, immutable decision, made in an instant, binding her to him for life. The gravity of it weighed on him, a silent, unrelenting force pressing against his chest. He had spent days trying to ignore it, telling himself it wasn't his responsibility. He hadn't chosen this. He hadn't asked for it. And yet, no matter where he went, the knowledge followed him, unshakable and suffocating. He found himself avoiding her. It wasn't intentional at first, but soon, it became deliberate. Whenever she entered a room, he found a reason to leave. When their paths crossed, he kept their conversations brief, professional. He told himself he needed time to think, but deep down he knew the truth. He was afraid of what it meant, afraid of what he might do, afraid of the way she looked at him, because for all his resistance, something in him was drawn to her. It was in the quiet way she carried herself, the way her violet eyes softened when she listened. It was in the rare moments when she spoke about her people, her voice steady but laced with something fragile. It was in the simple fact that despite everything, she never tried to force him into anything. She had made her choice, but she never demanded he make the same one. And somehow that made it worse. The YVRE elders had made it clear. If he refused, Alira would spend her life alone. She would never take another mate. She would never move on. The idea unsettled him in ways he didn't want to admit. One evening, unable to focus on anything else, he wandered the human YVRE research compound, his mind tangled in frustration. His steps took him outside, where the sky stretched vast and endless, the stars glimmering above like distant memories. He didn't expect to find Alira there, standing at the edge of the gardens, her gaze lifted toward the heavens. For a moment he hesitated. Then, before he could change his mind, he stepped closer. She turned at his approach, her face calm as always. But there was something unreadable in her expression. "You've been avoiding me," she said softly. Rayhan exhaled. There was no point in denying it. "Yeah." She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she looked back up at the sky, silent for a long moment. "Do you think your people will ever leave this world?" The question caught him off guard. "What?" She gestured toward the stars. "Your kind has always looked beyond. You dream of distant planets, of expansion, of discovery. Do you think one day, humans will no longer call this place home?" Rayhan studied her, sensing the deeper meaning behind her words. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe, but I think no matter where we go, we'll always leave something behind." She nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already known. "It is the same for us," she murmured. "We left our world behind, but it still calls to us." He wasn't sure what to say to that. Alira turned to face him fully. "I will not ask you for anything," she said. "I never will. But I need you to understand. This is not something I chose lightly." Rayhan swallowed hard. "And if I can't return it?" Her eyes softened, but there was no anger in them, no disappointment, only understanding. "Then I will accept it," she said simply. "But I will not stop feeling it." Something inside him twisted painfully. "Alira, this isn't fair," he said, his voice rough. "You don't even know me." She tilted her head slightly. "Then let me." It was so simple. No demands, no ultimatums, just an invitation. For the first time, Rayhan let himself really look at her, not as an impossible problem to solve, but as a person. As someone who had made a choice and was willing to bear the consequences, no matter how painful. And for the first time, he let himself wonder, what if he stopped fighting? He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know how to do this." Alira's lips curved into the barest hint of a smile. "Neither do I." It was the closest thing to an agreement they had. From that moment on, something shifted between them. Rayhan no longer avoided her. He still wasn't sure what he wanted, but he let himself be around her, let himself learn. They spoke more, sometimes about their work, sometimes about their cultures. She told him about the history of her people, about the great crystalline cities of Yviera, now lost forever. In return, he told her about Earth, not just the science and technology, but the art, the music, the chaotic beauty of human existence. Some nights, they would walk together through the compound, speaking of nothing in particular. Other times, they sat in comfortable silence. Rayhan found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, noticing the way the faint luminescence in her skin pulsed slightly when she was deep in thought. One evening, he found her in the library, studying an old human text with quiet fascination. "What are you reading?" he asked. Alira glanced up. "Poetry," she said, holding up the book. "Your people have a strange way with words." Rayhan smirked. "Strange how?" She tapped a passage on the page. "You describe love as something fleeting, something that fades and returns. For my people, love is never lost. It is eternal." He hesitated. "And if it's the wrong choice?" She met his gaze. "There is no wrong choice, only the one we make." Her words lingered in his mind long after he left the library. Days turned into weeks, and Rayhan found himself less resistant to her presence. It was still overwhelming at times, the thought of what she had given him so freely. But the more he knew her, the less it felt like a burden. One afternoon, as they worked together in the lab, Rayhan caught himself watching the way her fingers moved delicately over the console, her expression calm and focused. When she glanced up, catching his gaze, he quickly looked away. He was beginning to understand something he had refused to admit before. It wasn't just that Alira had chosen him. He was starting to choose her, too. But even as he struggled with his emotions, the outside world was not so understanding. Human media had caught wind of their connection, and speculation spread like wildfire. Some saw their bond as a romantic story, a symbol of unity between species. Others called it unnatural. The scrutiny was relentless, the pressure suffocating. One evening, after yet another news report dissecting their every interaction, Rayhan found Alira sitting quietly in their shared workspace. He sat beside her. "Does it bother you?" She glanced at him. "The opinions of those who do not know me do not concern me." He huffed a laugh. "I wish I had that kind of certainty." She was silent for a moment, then reached out, placing a hand over his. "I only need to know one thing," she said softly. "Do you regret it?" Rayhan looked at her, at the quiet patience in her eyes, at the warmth of her touch. And for the first time since this all began, he knew his answer. "No," he murmured. "I don't." Alira smiled, small but genuine. For the first time, Rayhan let himself smile back. "You said." The days passed with an unfamiliar ease, an unspoken understanding forming between them. Rayhan no longer felt the need to retreat whenever Alira was near. He no longer fought the strange pull that had once terrified him. Instead, he let himself learn. About her, about what it meant to be chosen, about the weight of the bond she had given him so willingly. There were still moments of uncertainty, times when he questioned whether he could ever truly match the certainty in Alira's gaze. But she never asked for anything he wasn't ready to give. She simply remained by his side, steady and patient, as if she had already accepted whatever his heart would decide. One evening, they found themselves alone in the observation deck of the research compound. The glass ceiling arched high above them, revealing the endless expanse of the cosmos. The stars shone brightly, and between them, distant nebulae glowed in soft hues of violet and gold. Rayhan leaned against the railing, his arms crossed. "I used to dream about space when I was a kid," he admitted. "Not just about exploring it. I wanted to understand it, to know why things worked the way they did." Alira stood beside him, her gaze following his. "And do you?" He exhaled. "Not even close." A hint of amusement flickered in her expression. "Perhaps some things are not meant to be fully understood, only felt." He turned to her. "Like your bond." She met his gaze, her violet eyes luminous in the dim light. "Yes." Rayhan hesitated before asking the question that had been lingering at the edge of his thoughts for weeks. What happens if a YVR's mate never returns the bond? She was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, she answered, "They endure." The simplicity of her words unsettled him. He had expected something dramatic, some tragic confirmation of what he already knew, that she would spend her life in solitude if he never made a choice. But endure carried a different weight. It wasn't sadness or despair. It was strength. It was Alira. And suddenly, Rayhan realized just how deeply he admired her. His throat tightened. "You really never had a choice, did you?" She shook her head. "Not in the way you think. I did not choose you logically. I did not weigh options. The moment I saw you, it was decided. But I did have a choice in how I would carry it." He searched her face, finding no trace of regret. "And if I had walked away?" Alira tilted her head slightly, considering. "I would have missed you." The honesty in her voice made something inside him ache. Before he could stop himself, he reached for her hand. She froze, her breath catching, but she did not pull away. Her fingers were warm against his, delicate but steady. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to feel it the way you do," he admitted. "I don't know if I'll wake up one day and just know." Alira studied him, her expression unreadable. "Then tell me what you do know." He swallowed. "That you make it hard not to care." Her lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected those words. Encouraged, he continued. "That when you look at me like that, I forget how impossible this is. Alira's fingers tightened around his. Then forget, she whispered. And for the first time since this all began, he did. He didn't think about the consequences, the expectations, the weight of an eternal decision. He simply let himself feel. Slowly, cautiously, he lifted his free hand to her face, brushing his fingertips along her cheek. Her skin was warm beneath his touch, her pulse a steady rhythm. She closed her eyes, leaning into his palm. And just like that, something inside him shifted. It wasn't certainty. Not yet. But it was something. A beginning. Alira opened her eyes, searching his face as if committing the moment to memory. You do not have to rush, she murmured. I will wait. Rayhan let out a shaky breath. I don't want you to wait forever. Her expression softened. Then do not make me. He didn't know if it was the stars, the quiet, or the way she said those words with such absolute trust, but something in him broke free. Without another thought, he leaned forward and kissed her. Alira inhaled sharply against his lips, but she didn't pull away. Her hands gripped his sleeves, grounding herself in the reality of the moment. The kiss was not perfect. It was uncertain, hesitant, but it was real. And when they parted, Alira's eyes shimmered, her fingers still clutching his. Rayhan exhaled, forehead resting against hers. I don't know what I'm doing, he confessed. Alira smiled, small and luminous. Then we will learn together. For the first time, the future didn't feel like an impossible choice. For the first time, Rayhan wasn't afraid of what came next. Rayhan had always thought love was something that happened gradually, something built piece by piece over time. But standing here now, with Alira's hand in his, he realized it wasn't that simple. Love wasn't always about knowing. Sometimes it was about choosing, and he was ready to choose. The following weeks passed in a way that felt different, yet entirely natural. Rayhan no longer second-guessed every glance, every touch, every quiet moment between them. He stopped thinking of their bond as something he had to understand and started accepting it for what it was. Something alive, something growing. He still didn't have all the answers. Maybe he never would. But he knew one thing with certainty. Alira was not just someone who had chosen him. She was someone he wanted to choose in return. One evening, as they walked along the outer gardens of the compound, the air thick with the scent of alien blossoms, Rayhan stopped abruptly. Alira turned to him, her violet eyes questioning. There's something I need to say, he told her. She waited, as patient as ever. He took a slow breath. I've spent so much time trying to make sense of this, trying to figure out if I could ever feel what you feel. And the truth is, I don't think I'll ever feel it the way you do. Something flickered in her expression. Not pain, not disappointment, just quiet understanding. But that doesn't mean I don't feel it at all, he continued. Because I do. And maybe I don't have the words for it yet. But I know that when I think about the future, you're in it. I know that when you're not around, I look for you. And I know that I don't want to live a life where you're only enduring. Alira's breath caught, her luminous skin pulsing faintly. Rayhan reached for her hand, holding it between both of his. I don't want you to wait anymore. I want to choose you. Alira stared at him, her grip tightening. Are you certain? She whispered. Rayhan smiled, small but real. I don't know if I'll ever have the kind of certainty you do, but I don't think love is about knowing everything. It's about choosing, every day. Alira exhaled softly, and then, in a movement so fluid it was almost instinctual, she pulled him into an embrace. Rayhan held her close, feeling the warmth of her against him, the quiet strength she carried so effortlessly. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. He pressed a kiss against her temple. I choose you, he murmured. Alira trembled slightly, and when she pulled back, there was something in her expression he had never seen before. Relief, joy, and something deeper, something infinite. Her voice was barely above a whisper. And I will always choose you. Rayhan smiled, his fingers threading through hers. The weight that had once felt like a burden was gone. In its place was something lighter, something steady. This was not the ending he had imagined when all of this began, but it was the only one that had ever truly made sense.